Just getting set up here right now. Welcome, everybody. My name is Maria Martinez Montt. I'm the Respect Life Coordinator for the Archdiocese of San Francisco. We welcome everybody tonight, and thank you for joining us tonight. We're going to start with a prayer of Josephine Bakita. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Josephine Bakita, you were sold into slavery as a child and endured untold hardship and suffering. Once liberated from your physical enslavement, you found true redemption in your encounter with Christ and his church. O Saint Bakita, assist all those who are trapped in a state of slavery. Intercede with God on their behalf so that they will be released from their chains of captivity. Those whom man enslaves, let God set free. Provide comfort to survivors of slavery and let them look to you as an example of hope and faith. Help all survivors find healing from their wounds. We ask for your prayers and intercessions for those enslaved among us. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. So tonight I want to welcome two very special guests. First, we're going to hear from Lisa Lungren, who is the National Education and Outreach Coordinator of Immigration and Anti-Trafficking from the USCCB. And after her presentation, we will hear from Grace Williams, the founder, president, and executive director of Children of the Immaculate Heart. So without further ado, we'll start with Lisa.
Thank you so much, Maria. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Hello, everyone. Good evening. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you here today. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Again, my name is Lisa Lungren, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for Immigration and Anti-Trafficking at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. And just a little bit of history, the USCCB has been working to combat trafficking for over 2 decades. And we do that mainly through a lot of education to the public, especially to dioceses and parishes and community groups. We also provide training and technical assistance to federal agencies such as law enforcement. And we also support survivors through community-based services. And we do that through a network of Catholic charities around the country who are on the ground directly serving trafficking victims. The most recent one that we have right now is funded by the Department of Justice, their Office for Victims of Crime. And I just wanted to talk to you a few minutes about that program because we're really excited about it. It's called Dignity of Work. And it's exciting because it gives survivors of trafficking, both US citizens and foreign-born, as long as they're over 16, the opportunity to work on their career goals. As you can imagine, most of their experience with work, whether they were sex or labor trafficked, has been full of exploitation, cruelty, and entrapment. So it's really the first time they can work towards their goals, to have a work opportunity where they're safe and their human rights are protected. And so we talk about getting them from survival to a place where they're thriving. And actually, the reason I wanted to bring this up is because the funding is coming from the Department of Justice. And you'll be happy to know that throughout the years, the Department of Justice is investing more and more money in direct services for victims of trafficking. In fact, just last year, they invested $101 million. And which is particular to our talk, now they fund specialized services for minor victims of trafficking in the U.S. And last year it was at 15.5 million. So we hope this will increase year to year. Excuse me, let me.
You're muted.
Thank you very much. To be careful when I get muted there. So during our time together today, we'll be looking at the topic of human trafficking, but specifically the sex trafficking of minors. We'll go over briefly the definition together, what it actually means for a minor to be sex trafficked. We'll look at some of the factors that make certain subsets of minors more susceptible than others. And then we'll conclude by looking at the process by which traffickers, the majority of which are called small-time traffickers in the US. We'll be looking at the process in which they lure, manipulate, and finally trap their minor victims victims in their exploitative extreme schemes. Now, since we won't be able to look at the entire phenomenon of minor sex trafficking, we're going to do a spotlight on minors who are US citizens that are forced to live what is known as a double life. In other words, while they appear to be living what may seem like a completely normal existence by going to school and going home to their families, they're being subjected to sex trafficking on the side. There we go. So just to get started, so we're all on the same page, I wanted to do a quick review of what human trafficking is. As many of you know, it's also often referred to as trafficking in persons, or also modern day slavery. It really manifests itself in two major ways: forced labor or sex trafficking. And sex trafficking is also called commercial sex exploitation. And it's the coercing of a person to perform sexual services for a trafficker's pleasure or profit. And I just want to let you know or talk about how Pope Francis refers to human trafficking. I love from Francis, one of his main priorities is to have our church combat trafficking as an urgent matter. Pope Francis calls trafficking a crime against humanity and an open wound on the body of contemporary society. So human trafficking in all its forms is a federal crime in the United States, and it has been since the year 2000. And it's a crime in all 50 states, US territories, and DC since 2015. And so I know I'm here today with a lot of wonderful Californians. I wanted you to know that your state enacted its first human trafficking law in 2005, AB 22. And that law makes trafficking a felony, and it provides assistance to victims to help rebuild their lives. Now, I know one of the big questions out there today on everyone's mind is, what is the scope? How many minor trafficking victims do we have? But before getting to this information, I just want to qualify that the statistics on trafficking as a whole are severely underreported, and that is due to its clandestine nature and the lack of uniform data. Other reasons for these misleading figures are the fact that minor victims often go unidentified. They're either silenced by fear or control of the trafficker, or they might not even identify as a victim due to the trauma bonds or attachments that they feel to their perpetrator, and we'll talk about that a little later. Thus, the number can be very misleading in the sense that it's not reflecting the full scope or prevalence. However, there are a few general statistics that you should be familiar with. First, we'll talk about them on a global scale. Per the International Labor Organization, who, by the way, have not updated these statistics since 2016, but per the IOL, on any given day of the year, there are nearly 25 million trafficking victims in forced labor and sex trafficking worldwide. Now, nearly 5 million of these victims are subjected to forced sexual exploitation. And of these nearly 5 million, 1 million are children who are being trafficked for sex. Imagine that. On any given day, 1 out of 5 sex trafficking victims are minors. Now, when we try to delve into the prevalence of child sex trafficking in the US, it can be even more difficult to find consistent data. So the best way I think I can give you an idea of its scope is to look at the data from the US National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And that center is known often by its acronym, NCMEC. NCMEC is the nation's clearinghouse for all issues related to the prevention and recovery of child victims. NCMEC actually has a cyber tip line, which is a centralized reporting system for the exploitation of children. And just last year, in 2020, NCMEC received 17,000 reports of possible child sex trafficking in the United States. 7% of those were reports, by the way, were cases of boys. One more interesting trend that I want you to be aware of that happens in the US is that the majority of victims, whether they're children or adults, the majority of victims of labor trafficking are usually foreign-born, while the vast majority of trafficking victims in the US are the vast majority of sex trafficking victims in the US are US citizens. So as you remember, I just mentioned a few moments ago that human trafficking became a federal crime in our country in 2000. And this happened because of the passage of a landmark legislation that you'll hear a lot about whenever you're reading about human trafficking, known as the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. You'll hear a lot about how it's called TVPA. And this is a landmark law because it is a law that it was established to prevent trafficking, to provide service to victims, and to punish traffickers. So on the right side of this graph, you'll see the definition of sex trafficking according to this Trafficking Victim Protection Act. It is when a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or where a person induced to perform such an act is under the age of 18. And it's really the second half of this definition that I want us to pay attention to because it's very critical for understanding minor sex trafficking. So think about this. Under federal US legislation, there is no such thing as an underage or minor prostitute. Under this legislation, any minor who engages in the commercial sex act is a victim of human trafficking. And it does not matter if there are any signs of force, fraud, or coercion. And I think this is really critical to understand because it can change the way that people respond to this crime. Children trapped in sex trafficking schemes are first and foremost victims, whether it be prostitution, pornography, stripping, you name it. Go to our next slide. So now we'll move on to children's heightened risk factors. First of all, human trafficking, you may have heard, really does span all demographics. Victims come from many diverse backgrounds, racial groups, socioeconomic groups, and it also occurs, as we mentioned, in all 50 states, and it crosses urban, suburban, and rural communities, and is even found in American Indian communities. However, there are youth that are at more risk than others. So first I want to go over with you the aspects that make minors at risk in general, just the fact that they're in the age of adolescence or preteens. And then we'll discuss why certain subsets of minors have more susceptibility than others. So here in the US, the studies concur that the average age for minor victims of trafficking is 14 to 16 years. But some studies are saying that the average is even younger, from 11 to 13. Preteen and adolescent girls are more susceptible to the calculated advances, deception, and manipulation tactics used by pimps. And when I'm using the word pimps in this presentation, I'm just using it as a synonym for trafficker. Now, this can be because of their emotional naivety about life outside of their family and friends, what life can really be like, and the dangers. But it also can be because of the defiance and rebelliousness that comes with adolescence, which places some children at risk. Traffickers can take advantage of this defiance. They give these children a taste of the forbidden adult world, luring them unexpectedly into exploitation. And we also have to think about the dependence that minors have on adults. Think about the children's emotional dependence on adults and their deep and real need for affection and attention when family members or caregivers are not giving them this basic need, they're going to seek this affirmation from the outside. And this can be exploited by traffickers. We can also think about financial dependence that children have on adults. Child victims may be reluctant to leave or seek services because even though they are in the most horrific experience, their basic survival needs are being met, and which aren't being met in the past when they were at home. Also, children with disabilities are at a high risk of being approached by a trafficker. Imagine children who are more physically dependent on someone else to take care of them. Imagine boys and girls with learning disabilities who are more vulnerable to manipulation because they lack the emotional and communication skills to understand and to resist exploitation. So we've seen some of the reasons why children in general can be susceptible to fall in the hands of traffickers due to their age and the social and emotional development that goes along with it. But there are subsets of minors that are particularly at risk, and we're going to look at those a few of those risk factors now. There's a quote from a case manager that works for a trafficking victim service provider that I wanted to read to you because I think it really puts things into perspective. She says, "We have girls whose parents are worth millions and bought them BMWs, and girls from abject poverty from Appalachia. The commonality that all of these minors have is that they had something in their lives that were making them vulnerable. So traffickers latch onto children with vulnerabilities in their lives. The family situation is one of the most prominent risk factors, particularly when a parent or a guardian or a caregiver is regularly absent. Why? Well, we spoke about children's dependence on adults. If a child is being neglected in their household, whether because of absent parents, a loss of a family member, breakdown of the family unit, or domestic violence, traffickers will seize on this neglect in a child's life. And the trafficker will spend, better yet, invest a lot of time with that potential victim. They will shower them with attention and pretend to fill that need of emotional support in a deceptive way. Youth who run away is another issue. When youth run away because there's serious problems at the home or maybe in the foster care home where they're living, as you can imagine, they're not going to find supportive networks on the streets. They're often approached by traffickers at shelters, at transportation hubs and public places. And per a study done by NCMEC, we talked about NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, 1 of 6 of 18,500 runaways reported missing were likely sex trafficking victims. And of these, 86% were in the care of social services or foster care when they ran away. Some of these children fall into survival sex, induced by traffickers involved in prostitution networks. And survival sex is exactly what it sounds like. It's an exchange of sexual activities for basic necessities, whether that be food, shelter, or money, any other item of value that a minor feels is helping them stay alive. Now, we also have community risk factors. Traffickers will often recruit in communities where they know they can find minors living in precarious situations, either because of high levels of poverty, homelessness, drug use, or even low literacy rates. Communities with high rates of school dropouts, under-resourced schools, violence and gangs are other things to look out for. In fact, there has been quite an increase in incidents of gangs involved in domestic sex trafficking. In fact, we know of cases where gangs members will set up fake social media accounts under names of fictitious adolescents and approach minors that way. So all these factors are important to consider when assessing a community's risk for minors to fall into sex trafficking. We also see that minors that are falling into sex trafficking often have a history of physical, sexual, or psychological abuse. These traumatic experiences can impact their own social, emotional development that can in turn affect that same child's understanding of personal safety, healthy boundaries, and healthy sexual boundaries. For example, minors who have been abused can view sex with a false sense of normality and be searching for quote unquote comfort that a trafficker will insidiously pretend to provide. Minors with histories of physical and sexual abuse will also have, a lot of the times, a diminished capacity to trust others, other adults, and to trust even themselves. Sometimes they blame themselves. And so all of a sudden you have a perpetrator that approaches and plays to that lack of self-worth by affirming the child, creating a state of dependency. Now we're going to, like I mentioned, we're going to be going over the process of how a minor victim is kept and under control in more detail. But for now, I want to go over what are the indicators known as invisible chains that keep a minor from not being able to escape sex trafficking. physical and sexual abuse that are inflicted upon the minor during sex trafficking can actually cause them to develop what is known as trauma bonds with the trafficker, which increases the minor's dependence on them. Trauma bonding has begun to receive increased acknowledgement and attention. It's also referred to as the Stockholm Syndrome. I'm sure many of you have heard that term. And it's when a trafficker uses rewards and punishments in a cycle of abuse that foster this powerful emotional connection with the trafficker. The trafficker may then assume the role as protector to maintain control of the victim, create confusion, and develop this connection. And this traumatic bond is solidified when the victims feel both fear of the trafficker as well as gratitude for any type of even a little bit of kindness shown. Also, many pimps use what is known as the lover boy technique to create dependency. And this is seen a lot with middle and high school girls. They will pose as a boyfriend and woo them with gifts and protection, adventure, promise of fulfilled dreams, anything that the child is needing or lacking. There can also be threats of violence and even death against the child or the child's family. And these may very well not be idle threats. The trafficker will exert his or her dominance, and the child will see the very likelihood that a dangerous fallout could result from leaving. Finally, there's a lot of use of shame and isolation. And it's not just isolation where the child is being moved from town to town. That does happen. But in the cases that we're talking about today, that we're focusing on, where the minors are supposed to be living out their normal life and being trafficked on the side, this isolation is more psychological in nature, where they're being pulled away from any existing support system they may have. So now we'll get to the crux of this talk and get really into minor sex trafficking in the US. As we said, under federal law, our Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, there's no such thing as a child prostitute. It's really important to keep this in mind because many times the way we conceptualize a given phenomenon is the way we respond to it. And for far too long, these children have been treated as criminals. So if you take anything from this presentation, just remember that under our federal law and under the consensus and understanding of this TVPA, every child engaging in commercial sex is a victim. And you know what? It's also a very hidden crime. It's a crime that truly hides in plain sight. Of course, we run the risk of speaking cliches when we say that, but it really is true, particularly in this form of trafficking that we're looking at. Minors will be going to school, living with their parents, but being trafficked on the side. And this type of trafficking is quite insidious because the traffickers do not want to raise alarms. They want to keep the child living their normal routine to lower their own risk of exposure to the law. Now, this type of trafficking can also be perpetrated by gang members and or unfortunately peer-aged individuals who pose as their boyfriends or girlfriends. These peer-aged individuals can either be working for the trafficker to help recruit, or they're the traffickers themselves. And this is a big problem again in middle schools and high schools. And it really adds a level of complexity to this crime because now we have children preying on children and through minor sex trafficking. So now let's get to the 3 stages that traffickers use to lure and capture and trap their victims, The first stage is known as grooming or seasoning. It's a slow, methodical, and intentional process which allows the trafficker to gain the individual's trust little by little. Traffickers always do look for the path of least resistance. So they're not going to go to after every child they see. They won't waste their times or expose themselves. Instead, as we've learned from the past few slides, they're going to profile the vulnerable. They're going to look for minors that show signs of exclusion and marginalization from the family. And they're going to go after children with low self-esteem and self-valuation. And then these traffickers are going to fill these gaps of attention with false love. So how do these traffickers locate the minors? These trafficker pimps will look for children online, such as false social media accounts, which is happening exponentially now that we're in a pandemic and there's been increased use of internet activity and online activity due to remote learning and just children being on their devices more. Traffickers look for children in person as well, whether it's malls, sporting events, schools, clubs, anywhere where children congregate. And they also place false advertisements many times online for modeling and acting, which is particularly appealing for young girls. Now, once a minor falls into this orbit, the trafficker has developed particular strategies to identify if that minor is ripe for falling into this type of exploitation. For example, many police departments have reported that traffickers will approach a given minor and compliment them or compliment her on her beauty. If she cannot take that compliment, if she looks down at her feet, he knows that perhaps there might be a victim there because he starts seeing that low self-esteem or self-evaluation. And he might begin to pursue that minor even further with further grooming. And this is just one of the methods that they use. If a trafficker is able to befriend a minor on Facebook or any social media account now, I know Facebook is not really for the young anymore, but they'll begin to look at all the posts and take notes of instances where the minor has expressed feelings of self-loathing, extreme satisfaction, or even desires to run away. And then they'll increase the grooming online for that minor. Just to continue stage one, the grooming stage, I just want to highlight a few more points that friends, parents, educators might notice. New friends might emerge in the minor's life that are significantly older. Traffickers tend to be older, although of course we learn that's not always the case because at times the perpetrator will send peer-aged boys to do the grooming. There may be random new friend requests on social media, and parents on this webinar will agree how difficult it is to monitor social media, but many times this is how the trafficker will emerge and try to get his victims. The minor might suddenly become uninterested in activities and pastimes once loved. We also want to be vigilant for unusual withdrawal or dejection. Now, I know teenagers, just as a matter of fact, can become withdrawn. So these are instances where this is particularly pronounced. Minors might also insist upon being alone a lot, talking to a supposed friend. Now, just to remind everyone, if a minor is exhibiting some of these indicators, it does not automatically mean that they're being groomed. But if you start seeing these signs and there's several of them at the same time, it might mean that a closer eye just needs to be placed on the minor's situation. Now we're going to go to stage two, isolating the minor. As this slide says, the priority in this stage is for the trafficker to find a problem to latch onto. Again, when we refer to isolation, we don't mean that the minor has been kidnapped. While this can happen, it is very rare. And in fact, it's actually the least common way minors fall into traffickers' hands. So again, I'm talking about psychological isolation. We have seen how traffickers can make their inroads into the child's life, perhaps by romancing them. So the trafficker will invest in the youth through expensive gifts, jewelry, parties, cash. And as we mentioned, he will go into the psyche of the minor so he can fulfill that void of vulnerability, whether it's attention, understanding, love, friendship, you name it. So in other words, the trafficker identifies the child's major gap or problem or challenge or difficulty, and then will make that child believe that he is the solution to the problem. This can create emotional dependence, which steadily marginalizes the youth from family, friends, or any support structure he or she may have. Continuing with stage two, we talked about adolescents that can feel hyper-focused on their need for independence. So there's this lure of transgression. Sometimes traffickers can capitalize on this to feed them with a false sense of freedom with alcohol and drugs. And obviously we all know this is false because the child is completely dependent on this perpetrator. You might also notice an unusual rise of interest in pornography. At this stage, the trafficker may be having the minor looking at the pornography almost obsessively. And as crazy or awful as that sounds, it's part of their training. And they could be expected to perform in ways that are being shown in these images and videos to which they're being exposed. Another indicator, a minor might be checking in with the trafficker continuously via social media, WhatsApp, and also the phone. In some, the trafficker will pervade almost every aspect of the minor's life as their supposed friend or romantic partner. Now we're going to the last stage, which is stage 3. The minor falls into trafficking. Almost invariably, the trafficker will choose to employ romance. And in this case, the trafficker will ask the minor for a favor. And this is usually the first commercial sex act that the minor has to perform. Trafficker will say, darling, I'm in need of money. Can you help me? I'm going to lose the apartment. I don't have enough money for rent. I'm going to lose my car. Can you just do this one thing for me? You know it doesn't matter because I'm the one that really loves you. And the minor will usually help. If you think about it, the minor's already been isolated from his or her social structures. The trafficker has done all all possible to become the minor's world. And so it's really hard to reject this quote unquote favor. So many of these traffickers that are having their victims living double lives will pay their victims. But while these minors may be carrying around hundreds or thousands of dollars, the trafficker is only, as you can imagine, sharing a sliver of his or her earnings. He or she is making exponentially more. The Urban Institute came out with a comprehensive study of the underground sex industry quite a few years ago. And even this was in 2016, even then the report said that the sex trafficking industry could make up to $300 million a year. And just as an example, in Atlanta, Georgia at that time, a trafficker could make up to $30,000 a week. So it's just to keep into perspective that if the minor is being given $1,000 a week, the trafficker is still making an obscene amount of money, obscenely higher amount of money, excuse me. And to a 13-year-old, $1,000 or $100 is a lot. So another indicator, a minor that's living this quote unquote double life will begin to, will begin to encroach on his or her school and family time. These forced dates, which in trafficking terms means an act of prostitution, will be scheduled at increasingly erratic times. And once firmly in control, the trafficker feels that he can schedule these quote unquote dates at any time. So many minors find themselves being forced to keep very unusual hours. They begin missing school, they have trouble sleeping, nightmares, etc. So all of this should be a cause of concern. Also during the stage when they fall into the actual act of sex trafficking, the minor may start dressing in what may be a very hypersexualized style. Now we know that adolescents in each generation dress in a way that are considered to the previous generation too provocative. But in this case, the change in dress is exaggerated even to what is considered normal to society standards. Minors may get into this outfit either before leaving the house or taking it in a backpack. Now, in terms of violence, in the cases we're looking at today, traffickers usually employ more of the psychological manipulation because they don't want the minor to have a lot of obvious bruises that can raise alarms with parents, teachers, and doctors, since they must keep up that facade of normal activities. But at the same time, beatings aren't uncommon. They are not uncommon. But in these cases, traffickers may be careful where they strike on the minor's body. According to the police, slapping, for example, on the face is quite common. We also need to talk about branding or tattoos that are common in all forms of trafficking, sex trafficking. The trafficker, the perpetrator will tattoo his name or nickname at times on the trafficking victim, signaling that they are his property. Now, when a trafficker wants to keep a minor leading a regular life as a facade, if he brands the minor, it will not be in an obvious place. And if in the case of these low-scale traffickers, they may have groups of victims who are forced to work for them, and they all share this particular tattoo.
Those kids.
Speaking of circle of other
So I always try to kind of stay up on everything.
Speaking of the circle of other victims, this might become the only social network for the minor. And so this goes back to this isolation.
She has
herself.
She has a lot of slides.
Not only from
because she goes really fast.
caregivers, teachers, and also their old
We
friends.
could have a handout that we can download, like she has these statistics. Anyway, give me an,
Okay, sorry everyone.
yeah, I'm gonna go back
I think
because
someone might
they
be,
got, oh my God, please.
you could all mute
Yeah, because-
yourself so everybody could hear. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Excuse me, I just want to go, but now that we've looked at all three stages, I wanted to go back at a graphic that talks about recruitment methods. This slide shows you recruitment methods that were reported by the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And this hotline connects victims and survivors of trafficking with services and support to get help and stay safe. This National Human Trafficking Hotline is actually run by an organization known as Polaris, which receives funds for this hotline by the Department of Health and Human Services. And this organization does everything well, very well documented and well researched. And this graphic, while it does have a very small sample size, does serve to visualize how the romantic way of recruiting tends to be the largest vehicle to which minors are ensnared. And if you can see here, remember we talked about how rare that kidnapping or forced abduction is. That's the lowest on the list with 7%. I also just wanted us to look at this testimonial because I think it really brings into clear relief the tragedy of sex trafficking and also the manipulation that goes on that forms trauma bonds. So let's read it. You will do anything to feel like his everything, and he promises you everything. And the things he convinces you to do, they don't seem that bad if afterwards he shows you how much he loves you. And as long as your profits meet expectations, you will have what you've wanted for your whole life. Love. Oh, excuse me. So now we're coming to the end of my talk, and then we'll get to hear from wonderful Grace. But I did want to mention a few special considerations with child victims. And this is more for clinical providers when they're working with children that could perhaps be victims of sex trafficking. We've covered a lot of these indicators already, so I'll just review a few. First, child victims really want to please, and so they're going to respond during interviews based on what they believe you want them to hear, so it's important to be aware of this. As we mentioned many times, there is a possibility of that trauma bond, so the minor might very well be still attached or in love with the trafficker and not consider themselves a victim at all. The minor may very well feel ashamed of what they agreed to do because they feel like in the beginning, maybe they entered voluntarily, but we all know that it's absolutely not their fault and they're a victim in this situation. And again, all of these indicators that you see on this slide should be kept in mind when either a school teacher, a school social worker, or any other clinical professional is ascertaining whether a child might be a victim of trafficking. So now, last but not least, I just wanted to go over some ways we can reduce child vulnerability. Some of them will be very familiar to you, but I thought it would be good if we looked at them as a whole. So we can work together on making sure, like I said, that we do reduce child vulnerability. The first is to establish these open lines of communication early on with our children so they feel comfortable enough to talk to us about what's going on in their lives. So we want them to be able to discuss how they can recognize and remove themselves from uncomfortable situations before something gets too urgent or dangerous. Throughout the webinar, we talked about how traffickers often target minors who have no relationships with their parents or caregivers. How many minors are having quality time with their parents or caregivers? Probably not many, and I think it's just a symptom of contemporary life. So we just really need to encourage overall more communication between children and parents, children and aunts and uncles, children and their caregivers. We need to realize how important these robust support structures are to make children understand that they're valued and loved. Of course, it's extremely important to not only know children's friends, but their acquaintances. Monitoring the internet and social media usage is of utmost importance. I know it's much easier said than done with technological advances and social media apps that are most popular with children evolving faster than we can think. But if we start with learning about online safety and the risks about sharing personal information with strangers or even acquaintances, because they might not be who they say they are online. We can start there and share it with children and youth. And I really want, and I can send this to Maria to make sure it gets to all of you. I really want to recommend NetSmart, which is part of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's online safety education program. And they provide great age-appropriate videos and activities to help children at every stage understand the potential online risks. And it really empowers them to prevent their own victimization and those of their friends by making them learn how to take make safer choices online. Of course, we should all continue to educate ourselves and our children on what human trafficking looks like and common grooming tactics. And last but not least, I want all of us to become familiar and save in your phone the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I have it on the next slide. It's 888-373-7888. You can call that number 24/7 to report a tip. And you don't need to place the burden on yourself and thinking you have to be the one to know 100% if this is a case of sex trafficking. Leave that to the trained hotline specialists, leave that to authorities, but call. They want to know if you have a suspicion and they'll walk you through it. So please use that number. Here's the number, and thank you so much for listening to me today. And I hope it gave you like an introduction into what sex trafficking is for minors in the United States.
Thank you, Lisa. So now we're gonna continue with Grace.
Thank you. Lisa, I'm gonna just have you give all my talks in the future about trafficking. That was perfect.
I know you're gonna be amazing.
It's interesting just because normally I'm the one saying a lot of those things. So it's interesting to hear it and just to reflect on my experience this last 6 months working with teenage victims of trafficking, and it's what you say is completely spot on. So I'm Grace Williams. I am the founder of Children of the Immaculate Heart. We're here in San Diego, California, working with both adult and children victims of sex trafficking. So I are under the motto, Restore All Things in Christ. Let's see, go, okay. This is a lot of facts, just really quick, just to kind of give you a context for San Diego to apply what Lisa was talking about here in one particular county. So there was a study done in 2016 that looked at gang involvement in sex trafficking. Lisa was talking about that. Here in San Diego, and I think it's fair to say largely in the United States, the majority of sex trafficking is gang involved or small organized crime units. So here in San Diego, 85% of traffickers that were interviewed in this study were gang involved. And there were 110 different gangs in San Diego County alone who are involved in facilitating sex trafficking. What often surprises people is that the sample of traffickers in prison contained approximately equal amounts of white, African American, and Hispanic traffickers, and the victims were the same. So this is really everyone's problem. It's not just connected with one part of society, or not really just a poverty issue. Like Lisa spoke about, it's the vulnerabilities, largely due to child neglect and child abuse that make for kids who are more easily groomed into trafficking. So yeah, 4 to 5 victims on average. So usually there's quite a number of children or women who are working for the same trafficker. $810 million a year industry here in San Diego alone. So very, very large financial underground industry. In San Diego, they say the average age is more in the 15, 16-year-old stage now. This is a little bit of an earlier statistic, but now they're saying around 16. But in any case, it's our teenage girls with 4,000 to 8,000 victims a year locally here just in San Diego. And often, again, Lisa talked about mostly about domestic sex trafficking. And that is the majority of sex trafficking here in San Diego. 80% of victims are from the United States. Only 20% are coming from other countries. Doesn't mean that so a lot of times it's a more of a passageway, because if you're bringing someone across the border, you don't want to leave them right here, so they might be brought deeper into the US. So there is definitely international sex trafficking happening. However, the majority is American-born citizens, and 28% of the victims in this study were found to be foster youth. So foster youth are at even higher risk, as we'll talk about when we talk about our program. Now, I wanted to just say a few things to go sort of to the 20,000-foot level. These statistics and these stories are often extremely sad to listen to, obviously. And I always want us to keep the perspective of the redemption, right? And we know by our faith that God would never allow evil to happen if he couldn't bring a greater good out of it. And that is really the only thing that makes it possible for me to go to work every day working directly with survivors. And my favorite encyclical, and we did the prayer to St. Bakita at the beginning. This encyclical was the first time I ever heard about St. Bakita, which was Pope Benedict's Spe Salvi, Saved in Hope, which came out, I don't know, well over a decade ago now. But it's my favorite encyclical on hope. And I just think this piece is really, really important. I mean, in it, our Pope Emeritus spoke about how a society is only a truly human society when the persons within it accept its suffering members. And the persons in a society can only accept the suffering members of society when those persons accept suffering in their own life. It's kind of, you can't give what you don't have, right? So if we haven't had this encounter with Christ where we allow him to redeem our suffering, and where we suffer with him and find what the way he's transforming us. Like JP2 spoke about suffering and said that God in suffering rebuilds goodness in the person who suffers, and also rebuilds goodness in the person around the person who suffers. And I can say that happens every day at our home. I mean, we become better for serving these children who are so broken, and they themselves are transformed by the power of the cross in this. So just to read this one quote from Pope Benedict, we can try to limit suffering, to fight against it, but we cannot eliminate it. It is when we attempt to avoid suffering by withdrawing from anything that might involve hurt, when we try to spare ourselves the effort and pain of pursuing truth, love, and goodness, that we drift into a life of emptiness, in which there may be almost no pain, but the dark sensation of meaninglessness and abandonment is all the greater. It is not by sidestepping or fleeing from suffering that we are healed, but rather by our capacity for accepting it, maturing through it, and finding meaning through union with Christ, who suffered with infinite love. So I always want to say that to set the stage for people not to go home depressed, but actually to go home with the great hope of the redemption of Jesus Christ. So I think we know this too, and I will get into our program right after this, but I think this is really important too, as far as, because people always want to know, what can we do? And Lisa spoke about many of those things, the most essential being loving the children that are in your life, which is the most effective thing you can do to build their resiliency to this. But we got here because of the general breakdown in the complementary relationship between man and woman. And we live in a society where, it's often just jokes about the war, like, the battle between the sexes, or where TV shows kind of have a big romance before people are married, but after people are married, it's just boring and bickering, and all these very, very bad ideas about what this is meant to be. And I mean, of course, the breakdown of the family leads not only to children who are vulnerable to trafficking, but also, there's, without being blunt, but there wouldn't be this much sex trafficking if there also weren't a demand for people who wanted to buy commercial sex. And this is a really, really big problem that's driving the whole thing. Widespread acceptance of contraception and the contraceptive mentality, which of course feeds into the breakdown of the family. I'm just going through it quickly for time's sake, but of course, abortion as the our victims of trafficking are often going to abortion mills. Traffickers simply bring them there. You can't sell someone for sex 10 times a night if they're always pregnant. So the whole sex trafficking industry is very, very much dependent upon all of our abortion industry as well. The objectification of women, of course. I mean, JP2 in his book, Love and Responsibility, right? He talks about how when it comes to the relationship between man and woman, the antithesis of love is not hatred. The antithesis of love is use. And so we have, use in the most utmost form happening in sex trafficking, where people are using children and women not only from the trafficker's perspective to make money, but also for just for pure sexual pleasure without thinking at all of the person. And this is pretty prevalent in our society in general. And these poor kids get the brunt of it in the worst possible way. Pornography also feeds into this in multiple ways. Every addiction works the same way. Your brain has a dopamine rush, and in order to get that same amount of pleasure the next time, you have to do something more because your receptors start to recede because it's too much. So oftentimes when people start to look at pornography, then they actually want to act these things out eventually. And as Lisa mentioned, we know this because traffickers will use porn to teach their victims what they want them to do, and sex buyers will come to their date with pornography showing what they want to do. So this feeds in multiple really destructive kinds of ways. So what do we do at Children of the Immaculate Heart? As I mentioned, we have two programs. Our first one we started back in 2014, which is for women over the age of 18 who have children who want to come out of life. Many programs here locally in San Diego can take single women, but it gets much more complicated when you have a woman with children who is in need herself of many services. So we provide each woman with an apartment where she can live with her kids and start to kind of build her family. We have case management, like support group or class, depending on the week, mentorship, providing them with transportation or assistance with transportation, and whatever their basic needs might be. We try to very much tailor it to each one. But I think Lisa's presentation shows people come from a very wide variety of backgrounds who are in this life. So sometimes we might have a client who has a really good job and can kind of function on that level, but on her personal life and other ways just has a lot of work that needs to be done. So we might not need as much financial assistance for her and might need much more human assistance. And then others, come to us with absolutely a plastic bag and that's all of their possessions. So we try to tailor it to each one's needs, but therapy, psychiatric services, and medical assistance are all essential parts of that program as well. And this is some of our stuff a couple of years ago. One of the most important elements in breaking through the effects of trauma in the brain is forming a relationship of trust with even just one other person. I mean, if you Google like TED Talks on trauma-informed care, you'll find some great stuff about this. And this is why my staff and I love what we do, because it's simply, not only is it a privilege to be able to be close to someone who doesn't let anyone be close to them, and to work through that and to take all the craziness, because they're going to test you to see if you really are the real deal. So you'll go through a lot of, waves sometimes. But then when that breakthrough happens, when really a person who maybe has kind of ceased to really believe in goodness believes in it again, is simply the most rewarding experience. Really, one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. I mean, it's funny when a new woman comes to our program or a new kid comes to the other house, just the things that they say within a week or two. Why is everybody here so nice? Just stuff like that. And then just like the suspicion around the goodness, like I can't believe people would actually be good to me. Like this doesn't make sense. Like what do you what do you want? Or particularly, we have one, a male staff at our children's home. It's mostly female, but one of our male staff, you know, one of the girls just said to him one day, like, I've just never had a guy around who didn't want anything from me. And we've had the same thing, our other program, we work out of a parish, and one of the women once asked one of the priests if he would make dinner for our group. So he made this really fancy dinner for us. And she told me in the car on the way, like, I just want to go because I've just never had a man who didn't want anything from me. And this is just, you know, just nice. So, you know, just being able to be a part of breaking through and those barriers of trust, and, you know, even on a physiological level, the effects of trauma in the brain is just very beautiful thing. Our other program is called the Refuge. It is a licensed by the California Department of Social Services as it's called a short-term residential therapeutic program. Fancy word for group home, a high-level care group home, where we have residential care, education on site, and also individual and group therapy on site. We partner with a group that comes to our house to do drug and alcohol treatment. So it's really kind of full wraparound services in a residential setting. That's 24/7 awake staff. We are hiring if anybody wants to move to San Diego. But yeah, it's a 6-bed home. We wanted to keep it small because you know, the home is exclusively for youth who are foster youth or kids who are on probation. So they're kids who are in the system, and we really want them to feel like they are at home and like they belong, not like they're just one more of a large number, but a place where they can really feel known and loved, which is, of course, the end for which God made us. Let's see. Oh, I thought there was another slide after that. Okay, well, ignore this slide momentarily. The Refuge just opened last September. It was quite a number of years in the making, which actually involved a lawsuit against the California Department of Social Services so that we could open it and operate in a Catholic way. So just last September we opened, so it's still quite a new program, but it's really I don't know. Everything Lisa said is what we experience all the time. I mean, these girls are often trying to go onto social media to contact older men and all these things. So it's very much, it's just something very, very deep because it's kids who really have nobody. I mean, it's quite tragic. The kids come to us and they have an approved contact list by their social worker. And sometimes a kid shows up and they have like one person that they're allowed to talk to in the whole world. Or maybe they have a longer list, but no one ever calls them. I mean, we had our first girl at the home was 14 years old. And like she was there for like weeks and her own mother just never reached out. And she knew it. You know, there's other kids with family coming to visit. And she's just like so alone in this world. So it's just, I mean, it's pretty hard to watch. Like one of our girls had court today, and our staff member who took them was just commenting to me afterwards how sad it was because there was a lawyer representing this girl's dad, a lawyer representing this girl's mom, but the dad and mom actually weren't there. So it's just like they don't even show up to court for them where their future is being decided. So it's so hard that they have oftentimes, you know, next to no one. So we just, you know, do our best to absolutely love on them, to spoil them a little bit. On a funny note, one of the girls 2 weeks ago, we were making breakfast and she was like, Grace, I'm really glad you made this house. And I'm really glad that we're here. And she said some other things like, she was funny. She's like, I'm glad your parents met. And one of the girls looked at her like, you're really weird. And she's like, no, seriously, if her parents hadn't met, this house wouldn't be here. It was like so funny. And she's like, I don't feel like I'm in a group home. I feel like I'm living with a rich family. So I guess that's good. So, I mean, and that's a girl who was in tears and would not even hardly look at anybody the day she arrived and wanted to go home. It was just, you know, so just seeing in a month, you know, a kid really really just feel like they can be themselves. I mean, the same kid just gets really goofy at night and told one of the staff, like, I only get like this around you and this other staff because I know you'll still accept me. So just letting them kind of blossom as normal children should. And I don't know, I think, every parent wants to really love their children and let their children become themselves and foster their gifts. And these kids don't even know often what their gifts are. They don't have a lot of hobbies. They don't necessarily, sometimes they do, but oftentimes don't necessarily even know what they're good at. And so at the Refuge, we really strive to like have them try a lot of new things, break through some fears, and find their gifts and hopefully find their way to a good path in this life. So what we would like to ask you for is your prayers. This is the devil's playground, really. I mean, the priest who got me interested in this work originally said to me once that, abortion kills children's bodies, trafficking kills children's souls. And that's really the reality of it. So our struggle is not against flesh and blood, so your prayers for this work and for our staff and the kids would be much appreciated. The next slide has our contact information, but our work does depend on the support of our benefactors, so we appreciate any support. And as I mentioned, we're always hiring or if you're local, volunteer opportunities abound as well. So you can email us at info@ciheart.org or visit our website, which is just childrenoftheimmaculatehart.org. I know that we were going to open up to questions after this, so.
Yes, so please, everybody, if you could look down on the bottom of your screen on your computer and through the chat, can you please submit your questions if you have any? Grace, how are children referred to you?
The kids are referred to us through their social worker or their probation officer. So we kind of do our work to network with the various county social workers. So right now, actually, all of our kids are from out of county, which is great because they have nobody to run away to, no one doing drugs locally who's going to bring that to them. But yeah, all referrals from one of those two agencies, from any county in the country, actually.
And how long do children stay with your group?
That program is a 6-month program. That's the way the licensing works. So the intention behind this kind of license is that kids who are coming because their behavior or mental health needs are too high to make it in a home-based setting. There will be either harm to themselves or to others if they're in a home-based setting. So they come to us and then we work with them right off the bat to develop a goal of where they want to go next. Is there family they can go to? Are they going back to foster care? Are they aging out and they're going to be in extended foster care or going to college or whatever? So we tailor our program to wherever their next step is, which should be something step down from us.
The next question is, are there other homes like Immaculate Heart in the country?
There are. There is one called Claire's House in the Diocese of Oakland, which also just opened last year, which is run by Catholic Charities there. There is another one here in San Diego that also opened last year, which is run by Hidden Treasures, and it's called Tiffany's Place. That is a Protestant faith-based run home. And I'm more familiar with California. But there are, I see this question about boys. There is one for boys called like Anchor House out on the East Coast. Again, also opened fairly recently. So yeah, there are others. There's one in Nevada. I know that kids from California were getting sent to for a while. That's CSEC specific. Yeah, so there are others, but it is still a highly underserved population, not nearly enough beds as there are kids who need them. I don't know, Lisa, if you know any out there.
I know there's Dawn's Place, which is also just for young women in Philadelphia, but just like you said, I know how underserved the population is. And so I was wondering if what happens, do you have a waiting list or?
We not really, because the referrals just come so much that it's kind of like when a bed opens. Counties will sometimes pay for a bed. If they can't send the kid yet, they'll basically like pay you to save the spot. But yeah, and it's the same with our program for the adult women. I mean, we just turn away more people than we're able to take. It's just the reality of it. But and we try to refer, you know, to other programs as well, even for the kids if we can't take them. But yeah, it's just part of the deal.
Next question is, even if poor areas are statistically harder hit, are there cases of exploitation among kids with higher level of social economic background? For both panelists, the question.
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, yes. I think it's more common, like maybe the more vulnerability factors there are, and then the risk kind of stacks up. But I mean, we had a client who was extremely well educated. I mean, had multiple degrees, but the history of sexual abuse and traumas kind of compounded to make her vulnerable to this, despite her education and even good job. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely not isolated to poor economic communities. I would say also, I mean, as far as I know, parents are always like, oh, my kids, and really just want to stress what Lisa was saying, like the best thing you can do for children is to really love them and just be attentive to their needs and make sure they're not falling through the cracks in any way, and to be smart, like monitor their social media to the best of your ability. Like, it's not an easy task having a house of teenage girls. But really, and I think educating them too. I mean, we had, sometimes the kids try to run away at the house, and our house manager gave them just a really clear talking to, because we have some pretty young ones who are a little bit less experienced, fortunately less exploited than some others. But she just gave, like, this is what could have happened to you. Like, if you do these things, like, you want to go with this, guy you're talking to online, like, we may never see you again, might never see your family again. Just really to be a healthy fear of God is a good thing too. I see this comment that San Bernardino has a house called, a place called Veronica's House for women with children as well. Yeah, there are several programs in San Diego for adults. The program for minors are much less common.
Any other question that anybody might have before we thank our speakers?
I'm trying to send a message, but I don't know how. I mean, I wrote it, but then how do I send it? Well, anyway, let me just ask you, the people you cannot help that you have to turn away, do you have other places that they can get some help? And if you can't, how do you detach from all the sadness and angst that you, God.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Every time we have a new staff member and it's their first time to turn someone away, they die every time. But we do, I mean, San Diego fortunately has a very collegial atmosphere among all the different service providers. So we do work together closely and have all the contact of the others. So we will give someone who calls us, all those contact information based on what their needs are. So yes, we definitely refer. I mean, even with the group home, if a social worker refers somebody to us, I might refer them to Hidden Treasures if we can't take the kid. So, you know, that fortunately is in place. I think, you know, I went on a retreat at the very beginning of starting this with the Miles Christi priests. I don't know if any of you are familiar, they're here in San Diego and also out in the Great Lakes area in Michigan. But the priest told me, he's like, you didn't start trafficking, so you don't have to end trafficking, but you just serve the person in front of you. And I think Mother Teresa's approach of just that one soul is all. And it's, I mean, it's really, you know, we were joking at the beginning of this that God is not pleased with numbers. And it's really about deep, not wide. I think that's the whole nature of our faith. I mean, Jesus called 12 people to transform the entire world. And all of us just have, I think, you know, these kinds of problems can be so overwhelming, but it's really just that one person that our Lord puts in front of us, whose entire life you can transform. And that's generational transformation too, because oftentimes kids get into this life because their mom was in this life. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I know I'm not the savior. That's Jesus's job. And when we have to turn someone away, we just have to entrust that soul to Him, you know, that He will take care of them in His way and time. And I think we also learn from trying to take too many that then you can't help anybody. So we all, you know, and you don't do the person a service in the end because you're like, I'm going to be there for you, and then you're not. Now you're just one person making up the promises. So like, that did not work. You tried that.
Thank you.
We have a next question. Any suggestion for possible high school activities to raise awareness about this problem?
Oh,
In his case, a Catholic high school. Do any of you, Lisa or Grace, have any suggestion?
For high school students?
Yes.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Awareness for raising awareness, ideas to raise awareness.
High school.
Like, if I may, like having some meetings with high school students. Sometimes there are general assemblies with the entire student body. Sometimes there are smaller activities like with the pro-life club, for example, but even bigger than that to involve maybe more students. Because who knows, some of the students in a school may be in that situation, or some kids may know a kid who is in that situation, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I know here in San Diego County, the school districts worked with, there's a human trafficking advisory council to the Board of Supervisors that I served on. So I kind of heard and watched them develop this one program. I don't know if it's good, I haven't seen it, but it's called the No More. It's like a curriculum that was developed to educate in high school, so like age appropriate, and it's like a dramatized thing. So they really try to help kids see that, like, if an older guy is like buying you all this stuff, and really teaches on like signs to watch for when that you might be being recruited. And I know they have had success in kids then speaking up to a school counselor or to a teacher they trust or something, because it kind of normalizes it in a sense, like this could actually happen. So then it gives them courage to speak up if they're at risk. There's another one that's like No More, and I can maybe email it to you afterwards, and you could send it out to the group with the link. But there are a few curriculums that have been developed here in San Diego for that.
You can do that. I can thank everybody that joined.
and maybe even middle school, the way things are going.
Yeah,
I mean, the way things.
Totally. They made different versions for middle
Yeah.
school and high school. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have a kid in the house who's in middle school, so it's very real.
Oh, God.
I know that, like Grace said, there's some good programs out there. For example, the Diocese of Orlando has their own human trafficking task force, and the former leader was Deacon Fred, amazing man, and he worked with the Catholic schools to get a curriculum in the middle and the high schools, and I'm happy to look that up for you as well. So then I know with Grace's suggestions in mind, you can have several examples of what's out there when it comes to educating, middle and high school boys and girls.
Is there any suggestion for kids that are in foster care that wouldn't have a family member look after them? How would you help those children?
Help them, sorry, just to clarify, if they are being trafficked, or help prevent?
Prevent, because, or I mean, I guess both, because I mean, like one of the ways to prevent it is to give them love, like you guys said, and be there for them. But if there's no one there for them, then they're more, I mean, how could we help those children?
Yeah, I mean, becoming a CASA or something like that is a great thing to do for foster youth. If you aren't familiar, it's a court-appointed special advocate. And there's a training that one has to go through, but I mean, basically become kind of a mentor for foster youth. And the nice thing is foster youth obviously move around a lot, but their CASA follows them to whatever placement they go to, whether if it's a family or a group home or whatever. And so that person, I mean, they can be as involved as they choose to be, but that's a really great way to support foster youth and to get to be, part of their life. And they go to court with them, and those kinds of people can be really a gift for these kids. Just one idea.
Well, actually, it's an amazing idea. As USCCB, we suggest to encourage people to consider becoming a foster parent, but that's a big responsibility. And here's a way you can get involved. Would you mind saying the name of the mentor, the title?
Yeah, it's CASA, which stands, so CASA, which stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, here I don't know, I'm sure in different states they have different like acronyms, but it falls under the title of Voices for Children as well, which would be the same in San Francisco for those who are there.
Yeah. Okay, I don't think we have any more questions. I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And this webinar, I'm going to make it available on our website, and also we'll be sending it out to everybody who registered for the webinar. And next webinar, it's going to be Lisa. Lisa, do you want to tell everybody what you're going to be speaking about for our next webinar?
Sure. Thank you. I hope you'll join me. I think it's in a week and a half. Is that right? Is that right? It's on a Tuesday, I think. Anyways, I hope you'll.
I don't know.
I hope. Oh, that's all right. I hope you'll all join me. We're going to be talking about our church as a whole and what we're doing as a church to combat trafficking. And we're going to. I'm going to introduce you to all the things that the religious sisters are doing. You'll be so amazed. They are just a powerhouse when it comes to preventing and preventing trafficking, doing advocacy, protecting our youth. So I'm excited to tell you about that. We're going to go through a whole bunch of activities that we can do on a local level to combat trafficking. As Grace was saying, and when you hear about it, it can sound so overwhelming, but it's so true what she said. I loved it, that Jesus told 12 people to change the world. And these are simple activities that you can do in an engagement and awareness movements. They're simple, but they're quite powerful. So we'll be talking about that. And then USCCB is going to launch both a Lenten and Spring campaign against forced labor and labor exploitation. And it's going to be all about the seafarer. During COVID, we're talking about all of these populations that are essential workers. And nobody knows that the seafarer is like the quintessential seafarer, because 90% of the products we're getting are coming from those people that are on the sea transporting the products to us. And the amazing thing about it is that in our own Catholic Church, we have a charity called Apostleship of the Sea, and there are port chaplains in every major port in the United States giving pastoral care and services and friendship to those fishers and seafarers. So I'm excited to tell you all about that and how we can make a difference. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, and good night to everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for hosting, Maria. Thanks to Grace and Lisa. Very interesting.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Try to maintain a positive